Thank you for waiting. So ladies and gentlemen, we will begin the last session of the day. Session 5, Gender Equality. Please welcome them with a big hand. Ms. Jim Blair from Amsterdam. Mr. Lam Lim from Brussels. Mr. Sturfes from Buenos Aires. Mr. Vasquez from the World Bank. And Ms. Ishikawa, Director of UN Women Japan Liaison Office, who will act as the moderator of this session.
Is this on? It's on? Hello, how are you? It's early of the day, so I guess you have all the energy to go along with this very exciting conversation. My name is Kai Ishikawa. I am the director of UN Women Japan Liaison Office, and I have a pleasure of moderating this session. Before I begin, I just want to say a few words about how important it is for UN Women to talk about city planning and the gender equality and empowerment of women and girls. Distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends, I would like to thank the government of Tokyo for their warm welcome as a host of the second Urban 20 Mayor Summit, building on the success of the first U20 in Buenos Aires, and for their kind invitation to UN Women to participate as a moderator of this session. In line with the SDGs, where we committed to create a world where all women and girls have equal opportunities and rights by 2030, this session focuses on concrete ways cities are accelerating actions. Urbanization does bring many important challenges, placing great pressure for local governments to respond, such as climate change, working with new modes of privatized security or transportation, and everyday forms of crime and violence, including sexual harassment, and thinking about the links that may also occur with transnational crime and the further control of women's bodies and movements. Given these complexities, cities have shared with us that they cannot afford to be doing business as usual or working in silos. They're in search of leading and implementing integrated human rights and evidence-based approaches to ensure safe, smart, and sustainable cities for women and girls. Local governments are in search of the right partners who can complement efforts and who can work within each of their areas of influence to go the distance together. They would like to access tools and learn from practices that can inform and be adapted to their own reality and context, and they seek to leverage resources to help achieve multiple sustainable development goals. This can be seen by many of the mayors, deputies, and other department leaders that are participating today, and who will share how they're accelerating action on gender equality across various SDGs, including SDG 5, which is gender equality, SDG 11, sustainable cities and communities, and SDG 16, which is peace and justice. Together with the other partners, UN Women launched a catalytic Safe Cities and Safe Public Spaces global flagship program. It started only with 5 cities, namely Cairo, Quito, Port Moresby, Kigali, and Delhi, but it actually expanded to 40 cities, including New York, Madrid, Mexico City, Montreal, and Sakai City, Japan. This global initiative is a cross-thematic program that brings together women's economic empowerment, political participation, and ending violence against women and girls, and peace and security. It focuses on the sexual harassment and other forms of sexual violence that women experience and fear daily on city streets, in markets, waiting for or on public transportation, and on their way to or from work, which is also a reality here in Japan too. Each city adopts a global framework but cultivates a locally owned approach based on their country and city context. and establishes and nurtures multi-sectoral and multi-level partnerships to achieve and sustain results in the lives of women and girls. This includes partnership from local, provincial, and national authorities, women's grassroots and other community groups, and engage with the media, universities, and the private sector. For example, in Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea, 80% of market vendors are women, and they are accompanied by children in age of 3 to 5 years old. Under the leadership of the government, with the support of UN Women and its funding partners, Safe Cities Women's Group with 50 representation from women was established. Changes have taken place in hard and soft public infrastructure, benefiting all market vendors and users, ensuring safe portable water, showers installed in the washroom, a children's playground in place, improved sanitation, and financial literacy training provided to market women, as well as providing safe public transportation for women and girls. A progress review carried out in the first intervention market called Gerefu in 2015 revealed that women's sense of safety in markets has improved. There are no reported incidents of violence in Gerefu markets since the first set of intervention have been implemented. I call upon many mayors and local leaders to make their commitment to a reality and join this global call as shared in the Communique 2019 of Urban 20, which I understand will be adopted tomorrow in Tokyo. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will now raise a series of questions to the panel of distinguished speakers. So the first round of questions, I would like to discuss what are the city's roles and responsibilities to promote gender equality and empowerment of women and girls. There are two key questions I would like to propose. One is how to ensure that women have the equal access to public services. When I say public services, and both hard and soft infrastructure that city provides, that's the first question. And the second question is how to adopt a gender perspective when cities develop and implement their policies and programs. Each speaker will have about 5 minutes to respond to the first round of questions. And I'm going to be the watch witch, so I would be very strict. So let's start with Sabine, Amsterdam. What has Amsterdam been doing to economically empower women and girls, such as equality in labor market and financial independence of more women? Sabine, you have a floor.
Thank you so much. Well, dear friends, let me start by sharing the best wishes of the Mayor of Amsterdam, Femke Halsema. As the first female mayor of Amsterdam, she truly regrets not being able to attend this U20 meeting, and in particular, of course, this panel session on gender equality. And secondly, as an introductory remark, I'd really like to thank the city of Tokyo, and in particular the governor. She herself is, of course, an icon for gender equality. And in addition, I would really like to thank our colleagues from TMG who are once again hosting a meeting on very relevant challenges to our cities. And I think it's very important that metropolis like Tokyo takes the lead in giving cities a global platform. And I think it's very important that cities also address the issue of gender equality. And in fact, I'm very happy to be on the stage with 3 male panelists, because I'm convinced that gender equality actually also requires the support of men. Which is something, and I'll get to that we also try to support as a city government. So turning to your question, financial independence of women is a persistent issue in Amsterdam. And although women's participation in employment has increased over the years, the distribution of unpaid and paid work between men and women has hardly changed. Women still have less paid work than men, work more often part-time, and provide more unpaid care. Only 52% of all women in Amsterdam are in fact economically independent. And recently, aging society is one of the reasons that there's an increase of informal care that mostly women take upon themselves, in fact, decreasing the participation of women in labor markets. Another relevant issue in maybe the lack of full women's participation in labor force and the lack of economic independence is part-time work, which for many cities and countries was considered a privilege of women in the Netherlands. But we found out there's also an important downside to that now. With the divorce rate being as high as it is in the Netherlands, around 40%, what we see is that a lot of women after divorce end up in poverty and become economically dependent on social support. So we've really found out that part-time work has its downside. And that's also a warning to all of you that many cities came to the Netherlands to see how we dealt with that. Well, the city, of course, strives to ensure that all Amsterdammers, regardless of gender, have the same chance of economic independence. And this is not yet the case. And especially women with low educational level, limited mastering of the Dutch language, and single mothers are vulnerable groups. And of course, we have special policy to address those vulnerable groups. Just to mention a few, we provide training loans to women who want to enhance their professional skills, to develop their talents. And what we found out, if even trainings to enhance self-confidence really improve the position of women in labor markets. We also support neighborhood initiatives where sometimes we as city authorities work together with private initiatives, some of them focusing on supporting the combination of work and childcare, for example. And there we as public authorities work very closely together with all kinds of small community initiatives. We also try to bridge the gaps between what women, very often single mothers, need and the needs of the labor market. We have a large shortage of workers in healthcare, and so we really try to cater for women that want to work in healthcare by providing better childcare again, and also to provide affordable housing, which is a big issue in our city, catering for nurses. We even now have special program for refugee women. We of course, like all cities in Europe, we host refugees in Amsterdam, and learning from mistakes we made in the past, in the 16th, where we had a large influx of migrant workers. We now have case managers also for women refugees. And then, as I said, we have special programs that support initiative focusing on the role of men, especially young men, in women's emancipation. And then to conclude, we also try to support women entrepreneurship. Women are really underrepresented, not only as top executives, but also as startup entrepreneurs, for example. We have found that venture capitalists are a lot less inclined to support women entrepreneurs, for example, than male startups or entrepreneurs. So we have a startup program, a new startup program for next 4 years, in which we are really trying to enhance women access to capitals. And maybe a special message from our mayor. She's told me that she has now started what she's called an old boys network for women, in which she really tried to create an increasing network of successful women that can be role model for all women of Amsterdam. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sabine. They're very interesting points that you raised, and I'll get back to you after we do the first round. But Fernando, whenever I say this name, I get nervous because that's my boss's name. But anyway, I hope you are as nice as my boss. So Buenos Aires considers gender equality a key priority. Its gender strategy is characterized by a focus on economic autonomy of women, aiming to include women in the labor market and to make them protagonists of the economic development of the city. Can you please tell us why it matters to your city and how your city specifically addresses those challenges? Fernando, you have a floor.
Okay. The general idea is that in the future, you are the boss. It matters to our city because it's not only a good business in terms of human rights, but it's also a good business in terms of competitiveness of the city. Buenos Aires has a future in what we call the talents-based industries, audiovisual, creativity, IT, educational services. So we have to work on generating the right talent, and we have to work in the quality of life of the city to attract the right talent. And talent doesn't discriminate on gender. So when we look at the statistics of Buenos Aires, and we see that we have women that are more educated than men, on average, but they are not participating in leadership positions in companies or in these dynamic sectors, it means that we as a city are losing a huge resource for productivity and competitiveness. And if you want to become a real global city, you need to generate the conditions for the bright and best women of the world to choose Buenos Aires to come and work and innovate and generate new businesses. That's why we like to say that the gender strategy of the city, yes, it serves kind of a human rights angle, but also it's at the core of the economic development of the city. That's why we are working on a couple of things similar to what my colleague from Amsterdam was describing. Something, I wouldn't say different, but I think we are particular of Buenos Aires is that 2 years ago, we incorporated into the official statistical system of the city a set of indicators that describe the modern agenda of gender equality in a given city, with the idea that when the state or the government formalizes in its statistical system a set of variables, it's signaling the message that the state, as a permanent policy, cares about that. It's like the unemployment rate in the 30s. It wasn't a problem until it was a problem, and then it was incorporated in the statistical system. And we did the same with a very progressive set of indicators, including the time of caretaking that men and women do, among others. So that was an innovation, I think. And we organized the set of indicators in the 3 main autonomies that research and internationally are recognized as the sectors to work, the political autonomy, the economic one, and the physical autonomy. We have a set of indicators for each of those areas. Then I think a distinctive aspect of our strategy is that we work very closely with the private sector. We launched a year and a half ago an initiative with the companies of the city that recognize that they have work to do, and we agree on certain aspects of the UN principles, women principles, that they have to address. We agreed also in the goal of lowering the salary gap that still are differentiating men and women in leadership positions. And we defined with them a work plan on 5 different areas, which are female economic participation, gender wage gap, women access to leadership positions, conciliation between work and family life, and women entrepreneurship. In each of those areas, there are specific actions that both the government and the private sector are taking in order to address those issues. And just to give you an example, from the side of the government, in order to promote a more equitable distribution of care and responsibilities, we approve a new model of shared parental leave for employees of the city government. And that was passed with the law last year. The new parental leave extends to 45 days for fathers and non-gestating parents to be used for caring for their newborn or recently adopted children, with the idea that those days can only be taken by the fathers. They are not exchangeable with the women. So they really are sharing the care responsibilities. And then there is a huge aspect and set of initiatives, as my colleague was saying, on women entrepreneurship. We have a source of a development bank of the city, the Bank of the City of Buenos Aires. We approve a specific line of credit for women entrepreneurs, and we try to mentor them with the help of other men entrepreneurs. We also share this idea of men committed to promoting women entrepreneurship. And yes, we approved the city's first SHIM specifically aimed at women entrepreneurs, and we have already 100 projects led by women. So again, to finish this first round, the idea is to make the women rights not only an expression of your social policy, but especially a huge attribute at the core of your development strategy. That's what the City of Buenos Aires is trying to do.
Thank you so much, Fernando. I'll get back to you in the second round, a few key words that you mentioned. So let me just move on to Christian. How are you doing?
Fine.
Good, good. How are we doing? Good? Okay. How does Brussels ensure that women have the equal access to public services and infrastructure city provides? You have the floor.
I would like first to thank the Metropolitan Government of Tokyo for giving me the opportunity to explain what we do in Brussels. First of all, I would like to precise the institutional Brussels situation. Gender policy is present at municipalities level, but it's mainly a region's task. You know that Belgium is a federal state, and it means that region and Brussels region can vote laws. We have a proactive gender policy, which is present since many years, but intensified for 5 years. We have two main instruments, gender mainstreaming and gender budgeting, because it's important to have a big statement, but I think it's more important to apply and to have a concrete and specific tools to reach the goals. I will give some details about gender mainstreaming and gender budgeting, and I would like to add a third element. It's also important to talk about other forms of discriminations and how to tackle them, because women of these groups are more vulnerable. It's intersectionality. I will give details. First of all, gender mainstreaming. We have a legal ground and tools since 2012 and 14. The philosophy is integrate gender dimension in all and every policies and actions, and our purpose is to avoid and rectify gender inequalities. We have tools like strategic objectives, like gender data and indicators to quantify progress and evaluate process. For example, a compendium of gender statistics concerning Brussels. I would like to give one example of gender mainstreaming policy implementation. If we take in public space bicycle path and lighting, it's obvious that we need adapting bicycle path to be secure in women's perspective. For example, fear of tunnels, of dark sections, of other elements. We have a lot of actual actions, a gender test, equal test, for every activity concerning Brussels citizens, a gender analysis must be made to make sure that there's activities of actions equally reach women and men. This concerns new legislation, subsidies, or strategic plans. All these tools must integrate gender dimension. Another example is campaigns on specific issues, on sexual consent, street harassment, violence against women and girls, etc. We also have gender policy in regional administration, in regional public service, human resource. We have a gender coordinator in each direction. We have pilot projects and diffusion in all administration. We have support tools as a handbook for each domain of public policy, bibliography of useful studies and books, etc. We organize also special formations for women and top managers. The second tool and second very important element is gender budgeting. Of course, gender policy is not only about quotas and legislation. An efficient policy implies a budget associated to it, otherwise change is not really implemented. Therefore, it's important to quantify which shares of a budget are dedicated to gender policies. So gender budgeting consists in determining through a split in 3 categories which part of a budget has an impact on equality between men and women. And for example, we have 3 categories of spending. We have spendings gender-oriented, for example, training, campaign against violence of street harassment, studies on gender. The spendings are related directly to gender. We have a second category, spendings which has no impact. It's possible, okay. And we have a third category, perhaps the most important, is gender undetermined. So we need to precise it. And for this category, the most difficult, we have a long and meticulous process which is being implemented in Brussels region to determine whether a budget and which amount thereof is dedicated to gender policy. For example, if we have to buy a suit for 5 men adapted to female anatomy, so 5 women, suits supply is a global budget, of course, and we have to isolate extra costs relating for having these suits. That means that gender budgeting clearly doesn't only refer the budget specifically dedicated, but we have to carry on a global approach. And the last element, and I finish with that, is intersectionality. So intersectional approach assume that people who combine different type of possible discrimination, gender, ethnic origin, handicap, sexual orientation, are far more often discriminated. For example, an handicapped woman or a woman with foreign origins can be difficult for her. And for people cumulating 2 discriminations, for example, it's not in reality 1 + 1 gives 2, but 1 + 1 gives 5, because it means a lot of things. In Brussels, we are one of the most diverse cities in the world. We are second after Dubai, concerning origin, because in Brussels, 60% of inhabitants are not born in Belgium. We have a large gay and lesbian community also. A lot of women with foreign origins have, for example, very bad unemployment rate for these persons. So women with foreign origins are more often victims of higher discrimination than their male counterparts. So every equal policy is in fact a gender policy. And I finish with that, how to tackle it. We created one service, Equal Brussels. All anti-discrimination and equality policies, gender, origin, sexual orientation, and handicap are united in one service. This allows an intersectional approach, notably concerning women in other potentially discriminated public, handicapped women, lesbian and transsexuals, women with foreign origin. And since 1st January, we have equal opportunity test. It means that every new legislation is checked concerning impact on every potentially discriminated groups.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So last but not least, Ed, I have a question from the perspective of an international organization that has helped a wide variety of cities to achieve prosperity. Can you tell us why gender equality and women empowerment are critical for cities? And what is the central role of city governments to achieve greater gender equality? You have the floor.
Thank you, Kay. How are you doing?
I'm all right. I'm coming down with a cold, but I'm okay.
Look, whenever I talk about cities and gender, I use a quote from the former Minister of Urban Development of Mexico, who before was the former Minister of Social Development and Gender, and who said, look, we have a really big challenge in cities because cities were designed and built by men in a family and cultural structure where the women stayed at home taking care of the children, the family, and the men came to work. And the way in which services, transportation, jobs, and housing, planning over all of the city is done, doesn't match the realities of today. And therefore, there are structural constraints that cities need to tackle altogether. Now, let me start with a few of data points from recent studies of the World Bank, because the numbers of missed opportunities by not having gender equality are just enormous. So we just finished a report on law and gender a couple of months ago to really try to analyze country by country the proportion of laws that discriminate against women. Access to finance, access, ability to register land and register property, etc. And we found that on average, women have 3/4 of the legal rights of men. So right there, just from the legislation point of view, there's a barrier to gender empowerment. Now, we also calculated what would happen if girls had the same educational opportunities as boys in terms of productivity over their lifetimes. And we found that the lost lifetime productivity and earnings today of countries due to that differentiation between girls and boys cost developing countries between $15 and $20 trillion. Trillion. So we're not talking about billions, trillions. And therefore, the economies are missing an opportunity that is just mind-boggling into this process. Now, we also analyze statistics of gender-based violence, and about 1 in 3 women has been subject to gender-based violence, and it changes from country to country, but when we go and we analyze the direct cost of the gender-based violence, it's several points of GDP. Okay? Our private sector arm, the IFC, analyzed what is the deficit, and actually Brussels was, and Amsterdam was talking a little bit about that deficit and on financial, the access of venture capital, or the access of financial resources from women-owned small businesses, and it turns that the deficit globally in developing countries is $1.5 trillion. So loss against women, okay? Tremendous opportunity for economic development, not enough financing, gender violence, so all of these things become just a really important dimension that gets translated into cities. Now, our strategy in the World Bank was a lot of what Brussels was saying, gender mainstreaming, on policies and programs that we support. And we made tremendous progress on that. And that is also part of what we continue to do. But we also realized that just doing gender mainstreaming all across was not giving the countries we support the results on gender balance. And therefore, our new strategy is trying to focus more on some critical areas for women empowerment. So the first one is try to break that tremendous gap that from the beginning girls face in terms of health and education. So we have a new human capital project that is trying to look at what are the factors that countries need to tackle, and within countries, cities are particularly important, to be able to have that productivity at the end of the education. And therefore, it is issues of stunting, it is issues of early childhood development. For girls, it is issues not only of educational achievement, but also the quality of that education, and it's also issues of girls and women's health into this process for productivity. And we finally, 6 months ago, had an important human capital index that is allowing us to be very purposeful about the dialogue with countries on what are the actions that need to do, again, for productivity, for gender balance in productivity, because Fernando was saying, it's not only the right thing to do, it's the smart economically thing to do. Second, focusing a lot on removing the constraints for women empowerment. And in cities, it means a lot of safe transport and safe spaces. It's a lot of child and family care, and it's a lot of reducing those occupational biases on sex segregation in many of these businesses. Third is a lot of removing barriers to women ownership for productive assets, particularly land and housing, which is so critical. And therefore, we may do reforms at the national level, but actually it's at the city level where land and housing become critical. How to make sure that that women and men are allowed to have both their names in the land title, that there's enough finance access so that women-headed households have access to housing. All of those issues become the third important pillar for our gender strategy in the World Bank. Finally is the issue of enhancing women's voice and agency to tackle gender-based violence, to tackle child marriage and social norms. And while national programs are important into this, we found that the action and the leadership of mayors makes all the difference in the changes of social norms, in the changes of saying gender-based violence is no longer acceptable, sexual harassment is no longer acceptable. And we find that actually action at the city level has been far more effective and far more productive and far more targeted to the specific social norms at the local level into this process. I'll conclude. Let me go back to the idea of how cities get organized and use the example of a project that we supported in Sao Paulo, where we were supporting the building of one of the metro lines. So what does that have to do with women? Yeah, the basics. Okay, let's try to make sure that they're safe. But then you start thinking and realizing that the way women move in their daily lives is very different to the way men move. Generally, men will go from house to jobs and back. Sometimes house to jobs to the bar and back. But for women, we realize, and actually it's fascinating to see this data in mobile phones, where you see that they do 6 to 7 more stops than men because they go to the schools. They go and take care of the elderly. They go to social programs to register the kids, and they stop all over the place. And then, as part of the of the metro system project that we were doing, actually we did single service, gender-focused spaces in the metro stations to reduce the burden of mobility of women. It's a completely different way of looking at infrastructure, and for our transport colleagues was a very revealing perspective to say, look, gender mainstreaming is not just a general box checking exercise or a little bit of the basics. It's how do you go deeper into transformation for women empowerment. I want to reinforce one point that my colleague from Brussels was saying, and that is the intersectorality, in the sense that we look at gender inclusion and gender balance not only as a women and men issue, but it's also we take a step back and we think about social inclusion in general, at the multiple identities that each of us has, that each member of society has. Because you have multiple identities that define the barriers, the exclusion that you face in society and in cities. So you have sometimes religious identity, sexual orientation, and gender identity. you have a location identity. So when you analyze the barriers that a woman versus a man has, it goes down with the women. But if the woman is in a low-income community, it goes down. If the woman is a widow, it goes down. If the woman has a disability or has a member of the family with disability, it goes down. If the woman is a lesbian, trans, or intersex, it goes down. And therefore, this multiplicity of barriers is what also needs to be analyzed in order to be able to not just focus on single topic issues, but on tackling the sources of exclusion in society, not only from the services perspective, but at the end, it's a lot about behavioral change and social norms.
Thank you so much, Ed. So I think we have about a little bit 5 minutes or so to go. And I have a challenge here and temptation whether I should continue to go around for the second round or try to get some interactive discussion with the audience. What do you think? Would you like to go around the second round, or would you like to actually have an interactive discussion? Any thoughts? No?
Discussion?
Yes. Interactive. So let me ask, and if the place is dead silent, then I would go to the second round of questions. How's that?
Not anymore.
Oh, great, thank you. Would you mind identifying yourself? And if you have any specific question to a specific panelist or just a general question.
Thank you very much. My name is Tony Taverna-Chirizan from the city of Johannesburg, South Africa. Very interesting discussion. I think one of my key issues, though, is a lot of the matters being raised are things that have to be addressed at a national level. It's not necessarily, I don't know if it's specific to South Africa, but when you're looking at employment laws, when you're looking at those policies, when South Africa's case is being addressed at a national level, one of the issues we have as well is maternity leave, where you do not get maternity leave rights within the first year of being in employment in a job. That's obviously a deterrent from women having children as well. I was very interested, Ed, with what you were saying around the fact that the important roles that mayors can play in changing social norms, because I think that's more realistic of the city's roles when it comes to gender equality. But I'm interested to know also in terms of Argentina, because there are lots of similarities in South Africa and Argentina, Buenos Aires, Johannesburg, in the actual role that the city itself plays in determining those policies and legislation. Because I'm wondering if it's something unique to South Africa where these things are determined at a national level, or whether those powers have filtered down to the local level. And then, Ed, if you can just elaborate a little bit on the roles that mayors can play in terms of adjusting social norms. Thank you.
Regarding your first question, that I think is dedicated to Buenos Aires. Yes, Argentina is a federal country with 3 levels of governments, and the laws in regards to labor regulations, of course, are national. But Buenos Aires, being the capital of the city and also probably the most global place of Argentina, has a huge signaling effect and demonstration effect. And what we are seeing, I will say in the last 2 or 3 years in regards to these issues, is that what Buenos Aires is doing and signaling and doing first is spreading rapidly to the rest of the country and finally to the federal government too. Or, even more complicated, sometimes the federal government, with which we have a political alignment, requests us, Buenos Aires, to do it first so we can generate the conversational conditions to advance that policy to the rest of the country. And in the case of the particular parental leave arrangement that I was describing, I say very carefully, I explain it, it only regulates the labor relationships between the employees of the city government and the city government. But we are seeing more and more that companies of the private sector in the city of Buenos Aires, even though they don't have a regulation to do the same from the federal government, are starting to do the same as a way of adjusting their attractiveness to the best and bright talent of the city, because most of the companies of the city are competing for that talent, same way that the city government is doing it. So in order to do that, you need to attract the best and bright, and for that they choose where to go, and being in a company that is progressive in this sense helps a lot the company and the productivity strategy.
So that's a practical example of how to go around that process. And what we found is that at the local level, that relationship between mayors and citizens is a lot more, there's a lot more proximity than at the national level to the local level. Finally, different cities have different cultural and social norms in the process, and therefore that's when cities can become more active in identifying the sources of exclusion. And for that, you really need to understand what is the exclusion, how is the exclusion applied, okay? And then finally, why? And that why becomes really important. The example that I use a lot is, and our social inclusion framework tries to understand that it's not only enough to give opportunities and to give excluded populations the ability to access those opportunities, but very importantly, even with opportunities and the ability, you need a sense of dignity of this community. So for example, the example that I use a lot is we were not able to understand why, after the government of India had done massive expansion of health clinics, geographically, with a lot of emphasis on local language and tribal languages to make sure that women would come to the clinics to have their babies, they were not reaching them. They were not coming. They were not coming, and then we're doing a lot of focus groups and understanding, and the standard answer is said, no, that's our traditions, we don't go. But you start unpacking why, and you start going into a really deep analysis of the why, the reasons, until you begin to realize that, yeah, it's close by, it's all that, but they treat us bad. And it's the most vulnerable time in a woman's life, and I really don't want to be treated that way. So that sense of dignity, of social norms, of trying to take the leadership of the city and saying, this is not acceptable for us as a society, we see that it's easier at the local level, and we see many mayors taking the leadership than at the national level for national transformation altogether. I think that at the national transformation, what we're trying to raise is a lot of the legal frameworks, the legal barriers that women have that need to be changed at that process, some of the land titling and access to assets that also need to happen at the national level. But I think that, as you were saying, social norms that local leadership makes all the difference.
Thank you. We are really running out of time, but I just want to give a chance to Sabine and Christian also to say a few words. And Sabine, you talked about aging society, which I think a lot of Japanese audience here can really relate to, and talking about the caregiver being disproportionately women, and you're providing some services and policies. What are the challenges that you faced in doing so? And if you have a wish list, what would be the number one thing that you want to have as in Amsterdam to address this aging society and women being the disproportionately a caretaker?
Yeah. Well, what we can do, of course, is as an employer give a good example. So when you work for the city administration and you're an informal caretaker, you get a lot of facilities to do so. In fact, we have an interesting system whereby colleagues that don't take up all their leave can actually donate leave to those colleagues that are informal caretakers. We call that the Gideon system. So that's a very concrete example of something that we are doing to facilitate informal care without people having the risk of losing their jobs, for instance. And by setting that example, of course, we also try to encourage the private sector to follow that example. Well, and maybe that was also still in reply to the colleague from Johannesburg. As a city, sometimes we don't hesitate to go against our national government. For instance, the example I gave of the programs we have for refugee women. In fact, we as cities are not allowed to help refugees that are still within the procedures, so to say, to get their permanent status, to help them to get to work. But we still do, because we are faced with the issues if people lag behind, we don't start to teach them the language, and we don't actually provide this access to work. And then it becomes a social issue to the city. So we're not afraid, sometimes we call the Republic of Amsterdam, to also go against our national government on some of the other issues regarding gender equality. Although the other issues and examples I mentioned are all within our own city responsibility.
Well, thank you so much, Sabine. Christian, you really touched upon this oh gosh, I can't say it. It's getting late. Intersectionality, which is really an important issue, but I guess we would need another half a day to talk about it.
Yes.
So let me just touch upon gender budgeting. Talk is cheap. When it comes to money, people start kind of stepping back. Did you experience any pushback when Brussels are trying to have this gender budgeting and determine amount of budget with a gender impact? Did you feel that there are some people who, because I do receive some pushback when I talk about money. When I talk about human rights and people say, yes, that's correct. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to allocating money for the program and then people start going, we have a tight budget and this and that. So did you have any experience in such way?
Not yet, because the first step was to have a clear picture of the situation, and it's the most difficult. The principle of gender budgeting was foreseen in a regulation in 2012. In 2016, the government adopted a concrete process to establish it. So it takes a lot of time because it can be very complicated. It takes a lot of time to build a tool which is clear, we can be applied without 100 pages of manual. And now we are in the situation of the picture to exactly share all spendings in some categories. And it's the first step to be aware of the situation. After that, the next step is, of course, to see some inequalities and to correct situation. We just begin with that. So I hope that in the future, it will be not too difficult to take the consequences of the situation and to adopt correct measures. But now it's not the case now, but I think that it will be critical in the next months, yes.
Great, thank you so much. I think I'm running out of time. It's such an exciting conversation and I can stay here, but I guess I'm getting some pressure that I need to wrap up. So perhaps we can continue this conversation off stage, maybe having a coffee. So I would stop here, but thank you very much for all the panelists and the audience. Sorry, my moderating skills were a bit, rough, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So now we would like to take photo together. So could you please come to the center of the stage, please? Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Jimblel, Mr. Lamlim, Mr. Straface, Mr. Vasquez, and Ms. Ishikawa. Thank you very much.